Hi, I'm State Senator Jose Menendez, and I'd like to welcome you to Holocaust Remembrance Week of 2022. I am so pleased you're joining students from across Texas and learning about the Holocaust. I also want to say thank you to the Texas Holocaust Genocide and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission, to the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio, and to all of the partners who've made these educational resources available to schools across the whole state of Texas. In 2019, State Representative Richard Raymond and I collaborated to pass Senate Bill 1828. The bill calls on the governor of the state to designate a Holocaust Remembrance Week in order to educate students about the Holocaust and inspire a sense of responsibility to recognize and uphold human value that helps prevent future atrocities. The bill passed both the House and Senate unanimously. That tells you how important this effort is to all of us. Senate Bill 1828 was made possible because of the persistence of local upstanders who call themselves the Four Ladies in a Car, because of their frequent trips to Austin on a mission to have a state-designated Holocaust Remembrance Week in Texas. They understand that it is a solemn duty to remember the Holocaust and to foster communities of awareness, care, and kindness. You're going to learn the stories of survivors of the Holocaust and about the upstanders whose compassionate actions saved many lives. You too can be heroes by speaking up whenever you witness injustice around you, or create change by working with your neighbors and local leaders to improve your community. I invite you to continue learning year-round about the heroic acts of upstanding. And just like the Four Ladies in a Car, please reach out to your elected officials in order to make a difference. You're always welcome to reach out to me at 210-733-6604. And I want to thank you for joining me today, and I hope you share everything you learned throughout this observation of the Holocaust Remembrance Week with everyone you meet. Have a great day. Hi, I'm State Senator.
I am pleased this morning to introduce Lois Roman as your speaker for today. Lois is a trustee of the Memorial Scrolls Trust and serves as the U.S. representative based on the East Coast. The Memorial Scrolls Trust is a London-based nonprofit which oversees the legacy of 1,564 Czech Torah scrolls that survived the Shoah. After a miraculous story of survival, these scrolls arrived in London and were dispersed on permanent loan to caring communities around the world. Lois began her involvement with MST several years ago, following a long career on Wall Street as a money manager. She is a master's candidate in the Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Yeshiva University and has an undergraduate degree from Brandeis University and an MBA from Columbia Business School. I'll now turn it over this morning to Lois Roman. Remember that the Q&A is open during this presentation, so if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box, and we'll look to them at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm so thrilled that I could be here during Holocaust Remembrance Week to share with you the story of the Memorial Scrolls Trust, which is a London-based charity, and our mission to care for a huge collection of Torah scrolls from the Czech lands that survived the Holocaust. And it really is a story of heroes and heroines, of rescue and of resistance, but maybe not the kind of resistance you're used to hearing about. This is a form of cultural resistance and spiritual resistance. And as I go through the story today, I want you to think about what choices you might make given the same circumstances. This story happened a long time ago, but there are opportunities in today's world to make just the same choices. So I am going to share my screen. Hang on one second while I get organized. So we're going to start at the beginning. What is a Torah scroll? The Torah is the most holy item in the Jewish religion. It is a handmade copy of the 5 books of Moses. It's written on parchment, which is animal skin, by a very special person called a sofer, and that person uses, still to this day, a feather pen and special ink to write this scroll in Hebrew. It's highly ritualistic when it's written and highly ritualistic when it's used. And here you see a picture of a Torah scroll today. Usually, they would be rolled up, as you see, dressed in some sort of textile with silver ornaments. And you can see that this one is in what looks like a wooden box. We call that the ark. And these objects you won't find in a store, and you won't see them being passed around outside. They are kept inside the Jewish synagogue building, in the sanctuary, in the front, in the closed wooden ark. And the only time that these objects are taken out are when there are at least 10 people in attendance, 10 adults, and during certain parts of a Jewish ceremony, and there are special words that are said before you pick it up, and everyone would be standing up, and their heads would be covered, and the most of the people would be covered with a prayer shawl. So suffice it to say that even if you don't know anything about Judaism, this is a very important object. And if you're not Jewish, it's an important object to you too, because the Torah scroll is the Old Testament for anyone who is Christian, and it also is the 5 books of Musa for anyone who's Muslim. So it doesn't cover all of the religions of the world, but it does cover a very large percent of people. Now, the other housekeeping item I want to talk about before I tell you the story itself is geography. This blue blob is a picture of present-day Czechia, or the Czech Republic. If you think back to your history classes, after World War I, there was a country created called Czechoslovakia, and it was the combination of 2 separate countries, the Czech lands, of which there were 2 parts, Bohemia and Moravia, and they added onto that the country of Slovakia, which would have been off to the lower right-hand corner in this chart. Today, we're only going to talk about the Czecho part of Czechoslovakia, Bohemia, and Moravia. And there's a couple of things I want to point out on this chart. First of all, I'm showing you where the big city and capital city of Prague is by the red arrow. It's very important for you to notice the countries that surround this Central European country. Germany borders on the left-hand side, Austria is to the south, and Poland is way off to the east. The little black dots on the chart show you the towns from where we collected our Torah scrolls, but these don't represent all of the Jewish towns. There used to be almost 400 towns that had Jews living in them before World War II. So there are 150 dots on this chart. Can you imagine if there were 400? The Jews in this area were what we call assimilated and reformed. What does that mean? Well, unlike the pictures you might imagine of Jews wearing black clothing and living in their own little enclaves eating special kinds of food, the Jews in this area adopted Reform Judaism from Germany, and that meant that although they may have defined themselves as Jews, they dressed like the local people, they ate the local food, they lived in many different towns, and they ran factories, they taught school, they went to university. So it's much like the story today in the United States, where there are some Jews that are very religious and live in special areas, and then there are other types of people of the Jewish faith that live right next door to you and go to school with you. So let's start our story 1,000 years ago. There were 1,000 years of Jewish history in Bohemia and Moravia before World War II. And the Jews were alternatively invited in by the rulers and then kicked out, and then invited in and kicked out, and they could only live in special towns. This is during the Middle Ages. And often they were invited in because they could serve as the bankers in different countries. Here on the left, I'm showing you a picture of a building called the Old New Synagogue, which is in Prague. It was built in the year 1270, and in fact, it's still there today. If you got on an airplane and went to Prague, you could go inside this building. The middle picture is an etching of a legend. The legend is about a golem. A golem is a monster. And ancient Jewish texts say that rabbis who knew special incantations could say these words over a lump of clay and create a monster to protect the Jewish community in times of strife. And then when the monster was no longer needed, the rabbi could say different words and that big monster would fall back into a lump of clay. Well, the story goes that this rabbi, Rabbi Lowy, who lived in the 1500s, scooped up that lump of clay after he didn't need protection anymore, and he put it in the attic of that building on the left in the Old New Synagogue. Well, you see from this story that the Jews were very spiritual, very mystical, and very superstitious, as were many people during that time frame. So the Jews were living in these special cities, and they often had to wear special clothing, funny-looking hats, some sort of insignia on their clothing. We're not talking about World War II. We're not talking about Nazis. We're talking about hundreds of years before that. Well, something special happened in 1848. This was the year that Jews were given citizenship in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now let's think about that for a second. In our American history classes, we learn that all men are created equal. And everyone who becomes a citizen of the United States because they were born here or because they took an oath to become a citizen are all equal and have the same opportunities. Well, that wasn't the case back in Europe, and this concept of freedom started in Europe during the French Revolution in 1789. And it took all that time from 1789 to 1848 for that concept to reach the Czech lands in the east. And the rulers said, starting today, Jews can go to school, they can own property, they are considered our citizens. Well, as you can imagine, being given freedom gave them opportunity and choice. So the Jews started to go to university, they moved out of the special areas in the big cities where they were living and moved into those 400 little towns we talked about before. It was a time of great prosperity also because it coincided with the Industrial Revolution. Factories were being built, railroads were being built, commerce was exploding, and there was a chance for people to make money, buy houses, and contribute to society. The Jews were so comfortable in this area that in 1906, about 50 years later, they opened the first Jewish museum in Prague. Now, we also take for granted today that there are museums everywhere, big museums, little museums, but museums were only created in the 1800s. And a special interest museum, a Jewish museum, was only beginning to start in the early numbers of the 1900s. So the Prague Jewish Museum was the third Jewish museum on the planet. It had about 1,000 objects in it, and the objects came from the older part of Prague. The city planners were deciding to improve the way the city of Prague looked, and around that time, they went into what was the old Jewish quarter that was kind of run down, and they started building new buildings. So a lot of the old Jewish prayer houses that weren't really being used anymore were flattened, and many of the objects that were in these buildings were given to the Jewish community in Prague, and they opened this museum. All sounds great, right? Well, not exactly. It was very nice time for Jews until 1939. And here I have a passport from Czechoslovakia dated 1939. If you were Jewish in the late 1930s in these lands, you were watching very carefully the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. Remember, Germany is the border the left-hand side western border of the Czech lands. And as the Nazi Party rose to power and they started saying that they wanted to reunite Germany into its previous glory before World War I, there was a landmass on the border of the Czech lands and Germany, and the Germans said, "That's ours, we want it back." So believe it or not, the Allied forces, the French and the British, and the Italians got together and annexed the western portion of Bohemia to Germany, thinking that if they gave Hitler some land back, he would be quiet. Well, he entered the Sudetenland, as it was called, and the first thing he did was bring in the tanks, kick out all the Jews, send them to Prague, and burn down all the synagogue buildings. Well, this was not good. And you can imagine that if you were a Jewish person in these lands, you would try to get out to safety. And you would use your passport and you would try to go to Western Europe or to Palestine, which is in the Middle East, or to the US. And many, many Jews did. But about 120,000 Jews still lived in Bohemia and Moravia when the Nazis invaded the entire area in 1939, World War II history or Holocaust history. But I'm going to tell you the story of our collection and how it survived the war. And I'm going to do it with talking about 4 miracles. So the first miracle is in hiding. Here is a picture of what happened to Torah scrolls when the Nazis invaded the Sudetenland. So they set the synagogues on fire, they gathered up all of the Torah scrolls, the most sacred item in Judaism, and they threw them in the corner. And here you can see they're unrolled, they're on the floor, they're ripped. The Jewish community saw that this happened when the Nazis first entered the Sudetenland before they occupied the rest of the Czech lands, and they were very concerned that when the Nazis took position in Prague, that all of the Jewish items, 1,000 years of history, were going to be destroyed. Well, in 1939, the Nazis did march into Prague and took over everything. And because this was the first place that the Nazis invaded, it wasn't as bad as what happened later on. So from 39 to 41, the Jews were no longer allowed to go to university and some of their occupations were curtailed, but they were still living in their homes in those 400 little towns. Some of the communities actually still had religious services, but life was getting tougher and tougher for them. It was at this point in 1941 when a new Nazi officer was stationed in Prague, and this gentleman was going to escalate things in a big way. He did not like the fact that the Jews were still living in their homes and that life was sort of normal for them. And also by 1941, the Nazis had tried to invade Russia and they failed. So now they began not just to want to conquer land, but to enter the final solution of actually killing all the Jews in Europe. So the Jewish community in Prague got together. There were just individual people. Some were the curators of the museum, some were writers, some were teachers, and they decided to hatch a plan to save the Judaica, to save the cultural items of the Jews that showed that they lived in these lands for 1,000 years. And so they went to the SS officer and said, "You've asked us to collect all of the silver from all of the little towns and send it to Prague." The Nazis always collected the silver. "How about we collect everything? Because we understand the Jewish texts and we can read the Hebrew language and we'll help you collect everything." Well, honestly, the SS officer thought that was a good idea because what did he know about Jewish items? And he really wanted the very best items for the library of ancient books, for the silver to melt down for the war effort, and for any other important items. And so the Jewish Museum of Prague went from having those 1,000 items to having 250,000 items in less than a year. And as the boxes came from all the small towns, every item was cataloged on an index card because there were no computers, And it showed what the item was, how old it was, where it came from, and it was put in a catalog, and then the item was tagged and put in storage. And the way the Czechs and the Germans stored things was to put all like items together. So for example, all of the Torah scrolls were put in one old building in Prague all together. Well, eventually all the Jews in the Czech lands, 120,000 of them, were deported first to Terezín, which was a concentration camp ghetto, people name it different things, right outside Prague. And from there, they were shipped off to the east into Poland to the death camps of Treblinka and Auschwitz. That brings me to miracle number 2. After the war, in 1945, only about 5,000 Jews who used to live in the Czech lands survived. And a few of them came back to Prague. One that came back, the miracle, is that it was the female curator of the museum. And she knew exactly where the Torah scrolls were kept during the war. Now here I have a modern picture of the Jewish town hall in the big city of Prague. And yes, the clock on the bottom has Hebrew letters and the clock on the top has Roman numerals. But the reason I'm showing you this is to tell you that Prague was not destroyed during the war. Bombs did not fall on the city like it did in Berlin or Warsaw, flattening those cities. Prague, all the buildings were still intact. That is important to our story because that meant the artifacts that were hidden in these buildings through the act of spiritual resistance by our heroes all survived. By 1948, 3 years later, the communists came and took over the Czech lands. Under communism, there is no organized religion. And the curator knew that if these objects were in these buildings in Prague, they would be in trouble again. So she approached the communist government and said something like, "Our junk from the museum is taking up 40 buildings in Prague that you probably want for the Communist Party. Why don't we move our stuff to the outskirts?" And the first place she went was to the Torah scrolls. She moved them to an abandoned synagogue building in the outskirts. She put them on wooden racks. They were already in big gray bags tied with a string with the identifying tag on them. And there they sat in bad conditions, snowy winters, rain, the roof leaked, the windows were broken, and so cold air and hot air came in and out. But nevertheless, the scrolls sat there from 1948 until 1964, which brings me to miracle number 3. In 1964, it was the Cold War, and there was a big wall that separated East Europe from West Europe. London, of course, was in the West, and it was commonplace for art dealers from London to get a special visa to be able to visit the East. And when they went on these visas, of course, they were followed around by secret agents, and all the spy movies you've ever seen came true. On one visit, a British art dealer named Eric Esterick was approached by a government official in Prague who tapped him on the shoulder and said, "We have Judaica for sale. Do you want it?" So Eric came back to London and went to this synagogue building in Knightsbridge, London. This synagogue is, we call, progressive. So the Jews here are, dressed like Londoners, and they interact like everyone else. They're not that religious. And one of the members of the organization, named Ralph Yablon, said, "If anything survived the Holocaust, also known as the Shoah, we will bring it to London and rescue the artifacts." So on a rainy Sunday afternoon in 1964, 2 trucks pulled up to this building where you see the car. Imagine 2 trucks, and the congregants of this shul building arrived on Sunday to unload the truck. And they started unloading these gigantic gray bags. They're about 2 or 3 feet long with little tags sticking off of them. And first they filled every table and chair on the first level of that building. Then every table and chair on the second, and every table and chair on the third. Eventually, 1,564 giant bags came off the truck. So the congregants asked the rabbi, "Can we open the bags and see what's inside?" They were so curious. And as they did, they realized that these Torah scrolls had been burnt in fires, they were ripped, they had bullet holes, some of them had blood stains on them, and many of the scrolls had little notes tucked in the rolls of the Torah scroll that were written in Czech or German or Hebrew that said, "Please help us, what's to become of us? Please remember the Jews of the Czech lands." That sparked the beginning of the Memorial Scrolls Trust charity in London. The scrolls were put into this nonprofit with the mission of making sure that the story survived and was told over and over again to the generations in the future. That brings me to miracle number 4. As soon as the scrolls arrived in London, letters came pouring in from all over the world. We have Holocaust survivors in our synagogue. We have Holocaust survivors in Australia. We have Holocaust survivors in South America. Can we have a scroll? Can we have a scroll? As time passed, 1,400 of the scrolls were sent all around the world, and they are still in communities from Australia to South America, throughout Europe, 1,000 scrolls in the US. There's a scroll at the museum right there in San Antonio. And so these objects survived all of these years to help us retell the story. Let's talk about the collection in total for a second. Here on the left, you see a picture of a scroll without its dressing, and you can clearly see that it's been burnt in a fire. I don't know the story about this particular scroll, but I like to imagine that when the synagogue was set on fire, it might not have been the rabbi or one of the Jews who ran in to save it. It might have been one of the non-Jewish Czech neighbors. People lived together. There was a 35% intermarriage rate between Jews and non-Jews. The Christians and Jews went to school together. They worked together. They employed each other. They were friends. The rest of the pictures here show you how beautiful our scrolls are inside. Remember that each one of these words written in Hebrew was handwritten with a feather pen by a scribe. And our collection is very old. Because Jews were there for so long, our Torah scrolls some of them are from the year 1250, the same year that that building was built in Prague that I showed you, all the way up to just at the beginning of World War II. Now, if I could put you all on a plane and take you to Bohemia and Moravia, I would do that. But since I can't, let me spend a few quick minutes showing you some pictures of what Bohemia and Moravia look like today. There's a town in Moravia called Donji Kalnic, and this synagogue was built a very long time ago. And after all the Jews were taken out of this town and killed during the war, only one survivor came back, and her name was Ruth Morgenstern, and she donated a little bit of money to help preserve the synagogue, but it wasn't enough to really save it. The rest of the town raised money so that they could fix the shul building so that it would stand as a memorial to the Jews that were killed. And on the right-hand side, you see that the prayers were actually painted on the walls from hundreds of years ago. There was no money for books, and so people would come to the shul and look up on the wall and be able to read the prayers. Here you can see beautiful painting around the window, and it looks very Bohemian or Moravian. It looks like Central Europe. The building was built in 1656 and it's been restored. There are no Jews in this town. I want you to think about that. Why should they preserve a synagogue in a small town in Moravia when there's no Jews to worship there? Here's another town, Slany. This one is in Bohemia. This is a picture of what used to be the synagogue building. It was built in 1865. It's been converted to a local police station because there are no Jews in Slany today. If you go inside the building, the stairs to go up to the women's gallery is still there, and the roof at the top still has the blue paint with the little yellow stars that were there when it was in use in 1930s. In this town, there's a Holocaust memorial, and every year, the townspeople of Slaney, no more Jews, non-Jews, have a celebration or a memorial at this Holocaust memorial you see on the top. And here's a picture of an elementary school teacher. She got together with her 7th and 8th graders and made them research the history of the Jewish people who never returned to this town. And she wrote a book, and you can see her proudly holding that book. So I ask you, what would you do if you lived in Slaney? Would you have thought to make a memorial? Would you have thought to write a book about your neighbors who never came back after the war? Here's another town, Polna. This synagogue building was built in 1685. Look how beautiful it is. It's been made into a museum. And on the right, you see that the steps to the mikveh, or the ritual bath, is still there in the back of the building. Why do this if there's no Jews in Polna anymore? In fact, in Polna, there's a celebration when people put stolpersteins down. Now, if you don't know what that is, look in the picture and you see the metal squares on the ground. They have writing on them. It's common in Central and Eastern Europe, wherever Jews were taken away from their homes and sent to the concentration camps and killed, to make this marker on the outside of the house where they used to live. And here you can see a little boy putting flowers down. He's not Jewish. These are not his relatives. He just lives in the town of Polna, and during their celebration, they're commemorating the people from the town who didn't come back. So I ask you this question. Why is there Jewish life in the Czech lands and there are very few Jews? Here you can see the Kolin synagogue building. It was built in 1642. It's absolutely beautiful. It's been made into a concert hall. Why didn't they just knock it down and build housing? It's interesting because the Jewish neighbors were so integrated into life in the Czech lands that when they were killed by the Nazis, not by the Czechs, by the Nazis who invaded the Czech lands, the Czechs missed their neighbors and they commemorate them in many, many different ways. There are many Jewish cemeteries still around. Honestly, I can't understand the number 6 million. It's too hard. People try to collect paper clips, they collect buttons. I can't wrap my head around 6 million people, 6 million Jewish people killed in Europe during the Holocaust for no reason other than the fact that one of their grandparents was Jewish. Think about that for a second. One of their grandparents. That meant the other 3 could have been Christian. That meant their parents could have been baptized, and that child would have been growing up in a Christian home going to church. And yet the Nazis did not care. If one of your grandparents was Jewish, you were considered Jewish and you were taken off to the camps. Imagine if that wasn't about Jews. Imagine if that was about people from a certain country or people who lived in a certain state. What if one of your grandparents lived in Ohio or Texas? So I ask you not to think so much about the 6 million. I challenge you to think about 1 times 6 million. Every single of the 6 million was an individual with a family, with dreams, with hopes for the future. MST has a lot of ongoing projects. We create books, we have binders, but I want to share with you before I go one activity that we have done in many places, which is to have collections, reunions of these scrolls. I said that 1,400 of them were out in the world, and many of them are in certain geographies. So in 2019, we gathered 75 of our scrolls together in New York, and 800 people came to see these scrolls. You can see just some of them here on the tables, each one lying next to each other. They hadn't been next to each other since 1964. So 60 years since they were all together. I have a little video from that day I want to share with you. As you see the people carrying the Torah scroll in the crowd, I want you to realize that every one of these scrolls represents an entire town of Jews that were killed during the Holocaust. Every one of our scrolls represents a community that was killed during the Holocaust. It's a messenger from that community to us today. I ask you this, where are the heroes in our story? Were they just the curators of the museum that gathered the objects? Was it the gentleman in London who brought the scrolls to London for safekeeping from behind the Iron Curtain? Is it all of the people in this picture, the ones carrying the scroll and the ones who came to hear the story? Or maybe it's all of you. All of you are the heroes to hear this story and tell your friends and neighbors about it. And maybe it sparks you into becoming a hero in today's world, not about the Torah scrolls, about tolerance and helping others and standing up for what's right. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to try to unshare my screen now, and I can take any questions that you might have.
So for those of you who are in attendance, we do have a Q&A chat box that is available for you to enter any questions that you might have. And so you can go ahead and take some time to do that now. While we're waiting on some questions, I do have a couple that I would like to ask as well. The first question is, are there any or how many Jewish people are left in the Czech lands today?
That's a great question. There are a few thousand Jews living in the Czech lands today. During communism, which lasted until 1989, it was hard to be religious of any kind in the Czech lands. And so the Jews that are there, some of them are expats, you know, someone from America or Britain who happens to be living in the Czech lands and they want to continue their Judaism. But the vast majority of people now defining as Jewish are people whose grandparents were Jewish and they survived or they came back to the Czech lands after the war and were a-religious. They weren't admitting to being Jewish. They were living under communist regime. They were Czech. And it was only recently that the grandparents may be passing away and when they're 80 or 90 years old, telling their grandchildren, you were Jewish. All of the grandparents were Jewish. You were born Jewish. You don't know anything about it. And those people are rediscovering their roots.
Okay, again, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A chat box and we'll be happy to have Ms. Roman answer them. Have any of these scrolls been returned to their original locations or to the Czech lands as well?
Yes, actually 2 of them have been, which is very exciting for us. For a long time, until about 5 years ago, we didn't think anything would ever go back to the Czech lands. The first scroll to go back was one in Moravia from a town called Alamush, small town, where the Jewish community started up again. And they contacted London and said, do you have our old scrolls? We'd love to have it back. And it turns out the scroll was in California at a synagogue building. So we called California and we said, hey, we can send you a different scroll. Can you give us that one back so we can send it to this town? And the people in California were heroes. And they said, we're going to do one better than that. We're going to fix up the scroll. And half of their congregation got on an airplane and they flew it all the way over to the Czech Republic and presented it in person to the Jewish community there. And the second scroll we gave back was just this past September in the big city of Prague to the new rabbi there, who's now using it regularly for services.
So we do have a question that came through. They wanted to know, when will the next scroll collection exhibit be? Are there any upcoming events? So I guess, where could people view items that are from the memorial scrolls?
Okay, so we have a lot of plans in the works, and unfortunately COVID stalled everything. We do have a big year coming up in 2024. It's our 60th anniversary year, 80th anniversary year, and we will be having exhibits all across the US. The best place for anyone in San Antonio to see one of our scrolls is actually your museum. And many of the synagogues also have them in San Antonio and in Texas in general. But my suggestion is to start right there at your museum.
Yes. So anyone who is in attendance that's in the San Antonio area or makes it this way, we do have one of the scrolls on display as part of our exhibit. All right. Do you have any more questions from anyone in attendance? That was a great question, though. Okay, we have one more question. Okay, so Adiseli wants to know, what caused so much anti-Semitism towards the Jewish communities?
That's a big question.
It's a big question.
So here's the very short answer to a very big question. There has been forms of anti-Semitism for thousands of years. And what exactly causes it can change by location. But I will say generally it's intolerance and it's a lack of knowledge. And it's very sad that even today, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the world. We just saw, this tragic event happen just a few days ago. And so I would say, this is only Lois's prescription for helping anti-Semitism, that the more we learn about each other, the less likely we are to make assumptions, get angry, and be aggressive. And so thank you for listening today. To those of you who don't know anything about Judaism, who've never seen a Torah scroll, that have never been inside a synagogue building, I hope this helped you learn that Jews are people too, just like you. They have passions. There's more that unites us than separates us. And yeah, I just hope education is a way of overcoming anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. Which Caitlin did just ask, what can we do to actively fight anti-Semitism in our day-to-day lives? And I think you did a great job answering it just now, but do you have anything to add?
I would just say, olive branch, reach out and get to know your neighbors. And it's not just anti-Semitism, it's Islamophobia, it's racism, it's all of those other terrible isms. If you count amongst your friends people that are different than you, that's the best thing you can do. And if you see that person who doesn't look like you, who doesn't believe the same things you do, being taunted by others, you literally stand next to them. That's the best thing, safety in numbers.
Very nice, thank you. And our attendees also say thank you for joining us today. And I also want to thank Lois for being here with us. It was wonderful to hear that story. So I do want to go ahead and just send a thank you to our sponsors who are, generous contributions have allowed us to have this program today, including the Texas Holocaust Genocide and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. And then I would just like to encourage everyone, we do have more presentations throughout the week. And so to learn more and to find out what presentations we have coming up, you can learn more at our website. And also, if you are viewing this presentation, either here in the Zoom webinar or through the live stream, we would encourage you to visit our website and fill out our post-event survey. That will help us as we plan more of these events in the future. So again, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to Lois Roman for being with us this morning and telling us this wonderful story. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.